And I sat down with them and, I said, how do you reach agreements here? Because they had a very centralized, rigid form of negotiation. Each side essentially just read their position papers at each other. And that was the way in which they negotiated. And I asked them, how do you break impasses? How do you break deadlocks? And they said, well, in the old days, the way that we got to agreements was we had an informal institution that we called the Wizards. And the Wizards were 2 Americans and 2 Russians who had 4 characteristics. They were bilingual in English and Russian. They were technically knowledgeable about the subject arms control. They were lower level than the ambassador. They couldn't make any decisions. And hence, as they joked, they were disposable. And whenever there was a problem in the negotiations, these 4 would get together at some restaurant in Geneva or on the ferry boat in the lake, and they would brainstorm. They would think about, well, how are we going to count the warheads this way? How are we going to do it that way? And they came up with a lot of options, each side knowing full well that neither side had the ability to commit because both sides were under the level of the ambassador. And the joke about being disposable was that if one side went too far, you could always ship them back to Moscow or Washington and say it was all a mistake. And a lot of the breakthroughs in the arms control negotiations came out of these informal conversations. So that's the challenge that we all face in a negotiation, is we need to become wizards. We need to find ways to separate the process of deciding, which is what the ambassadors did, from the process of inventing, which is what the wizards were doing, so that everyone can feel free to invent many options. You need to invent as many options as you can. You need to go to places, perhaps, that are informal. Every negotiation needs those informal venues, whether it's at a restaurant, or over a drink, or in the corridor, or at a retreat setting in the countryside, where people can get together and start to think, what are some wild ideas? What are some creative ways of arriving at a mutually satisfactory agreement? So the challenge, essentially, is for both sides to get side by side, face the problem, and see if you can get all that gold off the table. If inventing options is about expanding the pie, there still remains the problem of how you divide up the pie. How do you deal with differences, opposed interests? What if the customer wants to buy the product for a lower price and you want them to pay a higher price? What if you want a larger size of the company budget and so does the head of the other department? How do you handle those differences? How we handle differences like that, how we divide up the pie, ends up having an enormous impact on our relationship and how we conduct the negotiation. This is the crunch in a negotiation. Usually what happens all too often is people resolve differences on the basis of will and power. Who's stronger? Who's going to dig in more? Who's going to assert themselves more? Who's going to threaten more? And the cost of a contest of will like that can be enormous. Because what happens is the issue, the problem that you're trying to resolve, goes off the table. And what's on the table then is people's egos. And the question is, whose ego is going to win? People forget about interests. They're just focused on their positions. They're not inventing at all. And the real cost is one side or the other has to give in. And you won't like to give in if it's you, and they won't like to give in if it's them. And even if you are successful in making them give in, they're going to remember it. And they're going to think about getting their revenge next time. So if the costs of contests of will are so large, what's the alternative? The alternative, what you see successful negotiators use, is they try to decide opposed interests on the basis not of a contest of will, but on the basis of objective criteria. Objective criteria like, what's the market rate for the product? What are other people who are doing the same job? What are they paid? What about scientific judgment? What about reciprocity or equal treatment? All of those are like measuring sticks. ways in which we can measure what is fair, what's a fair way to divide up the pie. So neither side has to give in. Both sides can defer to what is fair. Let me give you an example. Two friends of mine who head up two large companies in their industry. Both are very dynamic, ambitious business leaders. And they both realized that if they merged their two companies, they could make a giant in their industry. The potential synergies were enormous. But such mergers often run into the problems of personalities, egos, both individual and organizational. And in this case, the question was, which leader was going to run the new combined company? Who was going to be the CEO? And where was the company headquarters going to be located? Was it going to be located on the west coast of the United States where one company was, or was it going to be located on the east coast? Now, these kinds of issues often break up mergers. And if the two leaders had decided to settle this on the basis of a contest of will, where each side threatened to pull out of the deal, there probably would have been no merger. And even if there had been an agreement, what kind of way is that to begin a corporate marriage? Instead, what these two business leaders did was they decided to resolve these issues on the basis of objective standards, on the basis of what was fair. So they looked at the question of who should be CEO. They looked at the qualifications of each. Both were equally qualified. But one was older than the other. One had more seniority in the industry than the other. And so they jointly decided that the leader who was older would become the CEO for a couple of years until he reached retirement age. And after that point, the other man would become the CEO of the company. The question of the company headquarters, they decided both headquarters were very beautiful and could well have suited the purpose. But they decided to settle on the basis of which headquarters was closer to the customer base. In this case, the number one customer of both companies, they were aerospace companies, was the U.S. federal government. So they decided that the company that was close to Washington, D.C. on the East Coast, that's where the headquarters ought to be. Well, the merger went through, and it became a spectacularly successful merger, thanks in no small part to the fairness with which the negotiation was conducted. So with objective criteria, neither side has to give in. Both sides defer to what's fair. It's much easier for the other side to defer to an objective criterion like market rate than it is for them to give into your position. And think about what they have to say when they go back to their people, to their boss, to their peers, and they have to explain why they decided to accept your proposal. It's much easier if they have some persuasive objective criteria to point to, like that's the way we did it before, that's the way others are doing it the same way, than it is for them to say, well, that's the most that they would give. Objective criteria not only build a better relationship, but they provide a better outcome. Now we come to the third phase of a negotiation, the phase of making proposals and trying to reach agreement. This brings up the question of power negotiation. What is power? Power negotiation is the ability to satisfy your interests. It's the ability to get what you want. And if you think about it in these terms, then every one of the principles that we've discussed thus far actually enhances your power. To the extent that you're able to go to the balcony and keep your eyes on what are your interests, you're more likely to satisfy your interests. That's the power of perspective. To the extent that you're able to step to the other person's side, listen to them, acknowledge them. We all know people who are good at doing that, and they're better able to get what they need or want from that person. That's the power of diplomacy. Then there's the power of focusing on interests, really understanding what are the other side's interests. That's the power of good intelligence, and it definitely enhances your ability to get a good agreement. Then there's the power of inventing options for mutual gain. That's the power of creativity, to come up with ideas that you might not have thought of before. Then there's the power of focusing on objective criteria, the power of persuasion, the power of legitimacy. And finally, there is a sixth source of power, which may be the most important, which is the power in a negotiation of having a good alternative. In other words, having a good course of action to follow to meet your interests if for some reason you're not able to reach agreement. Your best alternative is what are you going to do if you are not able to reach agreement with that particular person. Consider an example. A sales team that I know was working on a project for 6 months. They thought that they had the project all agreed upon. They were having one final meeting with the client, at which time the client said, look, I love the whole proposal, we love the project, we want to go ahead, but I'm afraid you're going to have to cut the price by 15%. Well, the sales team panicked. Their whole year's commission was dependent on this one project. They didn't think they could do anything else, so in that flash, they could see their whole life flash before their eyes, and in the end, they gave the customer a 10% discount. Now, that 10% discount turned out to be the entire profit margin on the project, all gone in 1 second. Now, think about what happened. The sales team thought, they hadn't thought through what were they going to do if they could not reach agreement with this particular customer. They didn't know what their alternative was. And even if they had thought it through, they thought they didn't have an alternative. But is this true? Is it really true that they didn't have an alternative? Consider a story of a Zen student who was drinking a cup of tea. And as he lifted the cup of tea to his lips, a Zen master came by with a big stick and said to him, if you drink that cup of tea, I'm going to hit you with a stick. And if you don't drink this cup of tea, I'm going to hit you with this stick. Now, if you were the Zen student, what would you do? Most of us think, well, if I'm going to be hit, I might as well drink the cup of tea and enjoy it. Or we think, okay, I'm not going to accept that. I'm going to fight back with the Zen master. Those are the two normal alternatives that we think of when we're confronted by superior power, which is either to submit to it because we have no choice or to fight back. But in fact, there are other alternatives. The Zen student, for example, could walk away, could exit the situation. Or the Zen student could, for example, take the stick away from the Zen master. He's not getting into a fight with the Zen master, he's just removing the Zen master's ability to hit him. Or the student might appeal to help to other students to see if they could be of assistance. So there are other alternatives in that situation, just as there were other alternatives in the situation of the sales team. The sales team, when confronted with the client who demanded a 15% discount, might have said, okay, we can't do business with this particular person in this company. Maybe there's someone else in the company whom we can talk to see if we can reach an agreement. Or perhaps they could have gone back to their boss and asked their boss to call the other person's boss in that company, in the customer, to see if they could reach a deal. Or perhaps they could say, wait a minute, maybe there are other customers who want the same kind of work, and we can use the time and the effort that we put into this project, we can deploy it for another customer. So there are other alternatives in life. So one of the keys in negotiation, before you get into any negotiation, one of the most important things you need to do is to always think through, what is my best alternative? What am I going to do if I'm not able to reach agreement with the other side? Is there any way that I can improve or develop that alternative to make it more satisfactory to me? And it's also useful to estimate the other side's alternative. What are they going to do if they're not able to reach agreement with you? What would the customer do in that particular situation? Because sometimes we think the customer is all powerful, but think about it. The customer has invested 6 months of time and effort in that particular project. It might put their plans into disarray if they were to try to go to another supplier. So knowing your best alternative, improving your best alternative, and estimating theirs is an effective way to pursue your interests and to balance the power with a seemingly more powerful negotiator. So you've engaged in problem solving. and you've now balanced the power. And you think that you have invented an option that meets your interests and meets theirs better than their alternative does. So you're probably on your way to an agreement. But what if they still say no? What if the more you push for your idea, the more they push back? What do you do in that situation? How do you close the negotiation? Think about it this way for a moment. You're over here. This is where you want them to be. This is your position. They're over here. This is where they are. And when you're over here, what you're saying to them is, come over to my position. Come over to where I want you to be. But that may not be so easy for them. If you put yourself in their shoes for a moment, it's not so easy for them to go over to where you want them to be, because it's like there's a big chasm, like the Grand Canyon, filled with anxiety, dissatisfaction, unmet needs. It's not so easy for them to go to where you want them to be. What this requires is for you for a moment to leave where your thinking is, and that's not easy, and for a moment to go and start where their thinking is. Start from their position and build them a golden bridge over that chasm of their dissatisfaction. Make it as attractive as possible for them to say yes. Make that bridge as golden as you possibly can. Let me give you an example. There was once a negotiation between a large multinational company and the owner of perhaps the most successful steakhouse in the United States. The company was interested in purchasing this steakhouse and turning it into a chain. Well, I had a conversation with the acquisitions negotiator, and he told me about how difficult this negotiation was, because he sat down with the owner of the steakhouse, and the more they talked, and the company made a very generous offer, and he said he wanted more, and the conversation went on for weeks and months, and finally the acquisitions negotiator was about to throw up his hands and go home. There was no use. Couldn't negotiate with the owner. Couldn't satisfy him. Just before he left, though, he thought, maybe there's something I've forgotten. Maybe there's something I've left out. Because what we tend to do in negotiation is we often think it's just a question of money. The acquisitions negotiator asked himself, what have I left out? What have I missed out on? He went back and talked to the owner of the steakhouse and found out that the owner wasn't so sure that he wanted to sell the restaurant. Why? Because he liked being the owner of this restaurant. He liked the feeling of control and autonomy that it gave him. He liked the feeling of recognition that it gave him as he went from table to table every night and everyone said, that's the owner of the restaurant. And he wasn't so sure that he wanted to be the employee of a big multinational company. So the acquisitions negotiator said, aha, we've uncovered some unmet needs, some unmet interests. Let's see if we can invent some options. So he went back to the owner and said, well, this would be rather unusual for a multinational company like ours and a single individual to form a joint venture. But what if we form a joint venture so that you won't work for us? You'll be the president of the joint venture. You'll have the autonomy and the control that you want. You'll have the recognition that you want. You'll be the president. And we'll buy 80% of the stock in this company from you. You'll own 20%. You'll be the president. You'll run things. And the longer you stay, the more we'll pay for your 20% of the stock if you want to sell it back to us, because we want to create an incentive for you to stay as long as you can so that we can learn from your management experience and turn this into a successful chain. Well, once the acquisitions negotiator framed the solution that way, the owner agreed. It met his interests. He got a fair price, a generous price. He got the autonomy and recognition that he wanted. That is the power of building the other side a golden bridge and of reaching a mutually satisfying agreement through this kind of negotiation. Satisfying agreement. Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Congratulations. Before concluding, I'd like to leave you with a note about ethics and negotiation. Negotiation is often associated in the public mind with various forms of deception or manipulation. And I've always found this interesting because in the 2 decades that I've been working in this field, working with some of the most successful negotiators in business, in law, in diplomacy, the thing that I've found that they value most is actually their reputation for honesty and fair dealing. Now, why would this be? Let me tell you a story to illuminate this. I have a friend whose name was Ambassador Carden. He was a British diplomat, and he was the British ambassador to the United Nations at the time of the 1967 Middle East War. And it was his job after the war to fashion the UN resolution to decide what should happen in the Middle East to resolve that conflict. It's known as UN Resolution 242. It's perhaps the most famous, one of the most famous resolutions in UN history. They're still talking about implementing it today. Well, it was a very difficult negotiation to try to bring all the parties together in agreement. And there was one holdout, and that was the Soviet Union. But after 3 weeks of arduous negotiation, Ambassador Carden decided that he needed to bring this to a vote. There was a lot of pressure from his foreign ministry and from the world generally to bring this to a vote. But it was a risk because the Soviet Union had a veto. 10 minutes before the vote, the Soviet ambassador approached him in the corridor and said, "Ambassador Carden, I'd like to ask you a favor. I would like to ask you to postpone that vote by 2 weeks." And Carden could see that he had built a very fragile coalition in favor of the amendment, that coalition could easily fragment in 2 weeks. So he had a lot of pressure on him to bring this to a vote. So he said, "I'm sorry, Ambassador Kuznetsov, but everyone knows where we stand on this resolution. I think we're going to have to proceed with the vote." And Ambassador Kuznetsov said, "Ambassador Carden, you must have misunderstood me. I'm asking you as a personal favor if you will postpone that vote by 2 weeks." And Carden told me that as soon as he heard the word personal in there, he knew that no matter how much pressure he was going to get from his own foreign ministry, no matter what the chances were of his coalition fracturing, he had to grant Kuznetsov his wish. Now, why was this? Because Kuznetsov, even though he represented a country, the Soviet Union, that had very little reputation in the international domain for honesty and fair dealing, Kuznetsov personally had that reputation among his diplomatic colleagues. And if he was taking his reputation, something that takes an entire lifetime to build, and putting it on the line, then Carden knew that he had to grant him his wish. So he did. 2 weeks went by. They're having the vote in the UN Security Council chamber. Going around, every country is voting in favor of the UN Resolution 242. The last to vote is the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Ambassador Kuznetsov raises his hand and votes in favor of the resolution. And sure enough, rather than using the 2 weeks to try to meddle, to try to destroy the agreement, he'd use the 2 weeks to go back to Moscow and persuade his superiors there to vote in favor of the resolution. But think about this for a moment. He never would have been able to buy those 2 weeks if he didn't have that reputation. If you have a reputation for honesty and fair dealing, the other side will give you the benefit of the doubt. They will believe you. You will have credibility. They will tell you information about their interests that they wouldn't otherwise share with you. You will have a much better chance of inventing options for mutual gain, of getting all the gold off the table. If you don't have that reputation, then people will either refuse to deal with you because you have a reputation for lying or manipulating, or if they are forced to deal with you, they'll deal with you at arm's length. And think about this for a moment. There's no question that through deception or manipulation you can gain a short-term advantage in any negotiation. Once. But think about this. You have thousands of negotiations ahead of you. It would be like a company taking all its capital and spending it on a single transaction, because that's what your reputation is. It's your capital. And that's why I think The most successful negotiators I know, why they value that reputation, that's their most valuable asset. In a negotiation, you have your word. Their most valuable asset is their reputation for honesty and fair dealing. It's not only the right thing to do, it produces the best results. We've talked about 7 principles for negotiating effectively, even in the most difficult situations. I'd like to leave you with one lesson that unites all 7 principles, and that's the lesson of becoming a reflective negotiator. Think about this for a moment. We say we negotiate, most of us, 50% of our time. If we were swimming 50% of our time, we would probably be in the Olympics. And the question is, as good as we might be at the art of negotiation, why aren't we all in the negotiation Olympics? I think the answer to that question is that when we swim, we always have part of our attention focused on the process of swimming, on our strokes, on our technique, so that we're continually improving the way in which we swim. When we negotiate, however, we have almost all of our attention focused not on the process, but on the outcome, on the dollars and cents, on the terms and conditions, on the substance of the agreement. And if we can learn to spend a little bit of our time and attention on the process of going to the balcony, of stepping to the other person's side, of focusing on interests and inventing options and using criteria, of developing a good alternative and building them a golden bridge. If we can focus on the process of doing those 7 things and continually improve our negotiations, continually learn from each negotiation, then we can end up as champions in the negotiation Olympics. I hope you will be able to apply these 7 principles with profit and satisfaction in your negotiations. I want to wish you all the best, and I want to encourage you to go for the gold.